For years, Julia had played by the rules of her HOA, but when they suddenly claimed her approved pergola was illegal, she knew she had to fight back. Little did she know, the truth would uncover a tangled web of corruption and deception at the highest levels of the neighborhood association. Now, Julia must risk everything to expose the truth and clear her name, even if it means going to war with her own community. Julia stared in disbelief at the bright red violation notice taped to her freshly stained pergola, the intricate wooden structure she had spent weeks meticulously building to code. Her heart raced as she read the words "illegal structure" stamped across the top in bold lettering. "This has to be some kind of mistake," she muttered, storming towards the HOA office, her hands shaking with a mix of confusion and fury. When she burst through the door, the manager, Mrs. Wilkins, looked up with feigned surprise. "Oh, Julia, we were just about to call you. There seems to be an issue with your pergola." "An issue?" Julia snapped. "You're telling me the pergola I had approved and built to your specifications is now somehow illegal?" Mrs. Wilkins pursed her lips, her eyes narrowing. "I'm afraid so. New guidelines were issued, and your structure no longer meets code. You'll need to have it removed immediately." Julia felt the blood rush to her face. "But that's impossible. I followed every single rule to the letter. You approved the plans yourself." "I'm sorry, Julia, but the decision has been made." Mrs. Wilkins clasped her hands primly. "If you refuse to take it down, we'll have no choice but to fine you and potentially take legal action." Rage boiled within Julia as she stared at the woman's cold, unrelenting expression. This wasn't about some new guideline. It was about control, pure and simple. The HOA had overstepped, and she refused to back down without a fight. "Fine me all you want," she spat. "I built that pergola fair and square, and I'm not taking it down. You'll have to drag me out of my own backyard." With that, Julia stormed out, her mind racing. She had to find a way to expose the truth and clear her name, no matter the cost. This wasn't just about her pergola. It was about standing up to the corrupt powers that ruled her neighborhood with an iron fist. Little did she know, the battle she was about to wage would uncover a tangled web of secrets that ran deeper than she ever could have imagined. Julia paced frantically around her kitchen, her mind racing as she tried to figure out her next move. The HOA had blindsided her, and she knew she couldn't back down without a fight. But taking on the neighborhood's elite power brokers was no easy task. She paused, her gaze settling on a framed photo on the counter. A snapshot of her and her husband, Jack, beaming as they stood in front of their newly built pergola. That structure represented so much more than just an outdoor structure. It was a symbol of their hard work, their dreams for the future. And she wasn't about to let the HOA take that away. Steeling her resolve, Julia grabbed her car keys and headed straight for the home of her next-door neighbor, Martha, one of the few people she trusted in this neighborhood of gossiping busybodies. Martha opened the door, her brow furrowing with concern as she took in Julia's agitated expression. "Goodness, Julia, what's wrong?" "The HOA," Julia blurted out, the words spilling from her lips. "They say my pergola is illegal and that I have to take it down." Martha's eyes widened. "But I thought you had their approval." "I did," Julia exclaimed, throwing her hands up in frustration. "They're claiming there are new guidelines, but I know they're just making excuses. This is about control, pure and simple." Martha shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. Those HOA vultures have been getting more and more power-hungry ever since the new board took over. I wouldn't put it past them to be up to something underhanded. Julia nodded, a spark of determination igniting in her eyes. "That's exactly what I'm going to find out. I need your help, Martha. I have to expose the truth and clear my name, no matter what it takes." Martha placed a reassuring hand on Julia's arm. "You know I've got your back. Whatever you need, I'm here." Feeling a renewed sense of hope, Julia stepped forward, her mind already whirring with a plan of attack. The HOA may have thought they could push her around, but they had no idea what they were up against. Julia sat hunched over her laptop, her brow furrowed in concentration as she meticulously combed through page after page of HOA meeting minutes and regulations. Martha hovered nearby, offering the occasional suggestion or word of encouragement. "Aha!" Julia suddenly exclaimed, her eyes lighting up with triumph. "I knew it. The HOA approved my pergola plans back in January, and the new guidelines they're claiming don't even go into effect until next year." Martha leaned in, peering at the screen. "So they're blatantly lying about the timeline. That's outrageous." Julia nodded grimly. "And that's not all. I did some digging, and it turns out the new board president, Sandra Wilkins, is the one who pushed through those guidelines in the first place. She even has a financial stake in a local construction company that specializes in pergola removal." "You've got to be kidding me," Martha breathed, her face twisted in disgust. "She's trying to line her own pockets by going after your pergola." "Exactly." Julia leaned back in her chair, a steely determination etched across her features. "This isn't about some minor code violation. It's about corruption, pure and simple. And I'm going to expose it all." Martha's eyes widened. "What are you going to do?" "First, I'm going to confront the HOA board directly," Julia declared. "I have the evidence, and I'm going to demand they reverse their decision and apologize. If they refuse—" She paused, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Well, let's just say I have a few tricks up my sleeve." Sensing the unwavering resolve in Julia's voice, Martha couldn't help but grin. "I've got your back, girl. Let's show these HOA bullies what happens when they mess with the wrong homeowner." Julia rose from her chair, her expression hardening. "Oh, they have no idea what they're in for. This is war." The air in the HOA board meeting room crackled with tension as Julia strode in, her chin held high. All eyes turned to her as she took her place at the center of the room, a stack of documents clutched tightly in her hands. "Thank you all for your time," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I'm here to address the issue regarding my pergola, which you've claimed is in violation of new guidelines." Sandra Wilkins, the smug-faced board president, leaned forward, an artificial smile plastered across her lips. Yes, Julia. We were just discussing your case. I'm afraid a decision is final. Your pergola must be removed." Julia held up a hand, silencing the murmurs of agreement from the other board members. "With all due respect, that decision is based on false information. I have here the minutes from the very meeting where my plans were approved, as well as a copy of the guidelines you claim I'm violating. And guess what? They don't even go into effect until next year." A hush fell over the room as Julia laid out the evidence, her gaze unwavering. She watched with satisfaction as the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their expressions darkening. "This is outrageous." Mrs. Wilkins sputtered, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "Those guidelines were put in place for a reason. Your pergola is still out of compliance." "Oh, really?" Julia retorted, her eyes narrowing. "Because it seems to me that the only ones out of compliance here are the members of this board. Tell me, Mrs. Wilkins, what's your financial stake in the construction company that specializes in pergola removal?" The room erupted in a flurry of shocked murmurs and whispered accusations. Mrs. Wilkins gaped at Julia, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her composure crumbling. Julia leaned in, her voice dripping with disdain. "Don't play dumb with me. I've got the evidence, and I'm not going away until you admit the truth and reverse your decision on my pergola." The board members exchanged uneasy glances, the tension in the room palpable. Julia knew she had them cornered, and she was determined to squeeze every last drop of justice from this confrontation. This was no longer just about her pergola. It was about standing up to the corruption that had taken over her neighborhood. and she was ready to fight tooth and nail to expose the truth. The room fell deathly silent as Julia stared down the cornered HOA board members, her gaze unwavering. She could practically feel the tension radiating from them, the weight of her damning evidence pressing down on their collective conscience. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mrs. Wilkins let out a defeated sigh and slowly rose from her seat. "Very well, Julia. You've made your point. The board has decided to rescind our previous decision regarding your pergola." A ripple of murmurs swept through the room, and Julia couldn't help but feel a surge of triumph. "And?" she prompted, arching a brow. Mrs. Wilkins shot her a withering look. "And we'll be launching a full investigation into the matter. If any wrongdoing is found, appropriate actions will be taken." Julia nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I appreciate your cooperation, and I look forward to seeing the results of that investigation." With that, she turned on her heel and strode out of the room, her head held high. As she stepped out into the bright sunlight, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had won the first battle, but she knew the war was far from over. When she returned home, Martha was waiting anxiously on her doorstep. "Well?" she demanded, her eyes shining with anticipation. They backed down, Julia announced, a grin spreading across her face. "For now, at least. But they're launching an investigation, so we'll have to stay vigilant." Martha let out a whoop of joy, pulling Julia into a tight embrace. "I knew you could do it. Those HOA bullies never stood a chance against you." Julia chuckled, her expression turning serious. "This is just the beginning, Martha. I won't rest until I've exposed the full extent of their corruption. They've been getting away with this kind of thing for far too long." Martha nodded, her brow furrowing with determination. "Whatever you need, I'm with you. We'll take these HOA vultures down, one by one if we have to." As the two women stood together, united in their mission, Julia felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew the road ahead would be long and arduous, but she was ready to face it head-on. This was no longer just about her pergola. It was about reclaiming her community, her freedom, and her sense of justice. The battle lines had been drawn, and Julia was prepared to wage war. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity as Julia and Martha worked tirelessly to uncover the truth behind the HOA's corruption. They pored over financial records, interviewed neighbors, and combed through every nook and cranny of the association's policies, determined to shine a light on the misdeeds that had been lurking in the shadows. "This is worse than we thought," Julia murmured one evening, her brow furrowed as she reviewed a stack of documents. "The financial ties between the board members and that construction company go back years. It's a veritable web of deceit." Martha let out a low whistle, her eyes widening. "And to think they were trying to use your pergola as a way to line their own pockets. Unbelievable." Julia nodded grimly. "We're talking kickbacks, under-the-table deals, the whole 9 yards. These people have been abusing their power for personal gain, and they've been getting away with it for far too long." Determined to expose the truth, Julia and Martha began reaching out to other homeowners in the neighborhood, gathering testimonies and building a case that could not be ignored. Word quickly spread, and soon, a growing number of residents joined their cause, outraged by the blatant corruption they had uncovered. As the investigation gained momentum, the HOA board members grew increasingly nervous, their attempts to cover their tracks becoming more and more desperate. They tried to intimidate Julia and her allies, threatening legal action and even going so far as to vandalize her beloved pergola. But Julia refused to be cowed. She stood her ground, her resolve only strengthening with each new revelation. This was no longer just about her own battle. It was about reclaiming the very soul of her community. "They're scared, Martha," she said one night, her eyes gleaming with a fierce determination. "They know their house of cards is about to come crashing down, and they're running scared." Martha nodded, a wicked grin spreading across her face. "Then let's give them a good shove, shall we?" As the two women plotted their next move, the tension in the neighborhood reached a fever pitch. The stage was set for an epic showdown, and Julia was more than ready to take on the corrupt HOA board, no matter the cost. The community meeting hall was packed to the brim, the air thick with a palpable sense of anticipation. Julia stood at the front of the room, her expression resolute as she faced the sea of familiar and unfamiliar faces. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice steady and clear. "As you know, what started as a simple dispute over my pergola has uncovered a much deeper, more troubling issue within our HOA." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Julia took a deep breath before continuing. "Through our investigation, we've uncovered a web of corruption and self-dealing that reaches to the highest levels of the board. Kickbacks, undisclosed conflicts of interest, and blatant misuse of HOA funds. It's all here, in black and white." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. "Now, I know some of you may be hesitant to believe these claims, but I can assure you the evidence is irrefutable. We've compiled sworn testimonies, financial records, and even surveillance footage that proves the board has been using their positions of power to line their own pockets." The crowd erupted in a chorus of outraged cries, and Julia had to raise her hand to regain control of the room. "I know this is a lot to take in, but we can't afford to stay silent any longer. These people have betrayed the trust of our community, and it's time we take action to hold them accountable." As she spoke, the doors at the back of the hall burst open, and a group of uniformed officers filed in, their faces grim. Julia felt a surge of triumph. The final piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place. "What is the meaning of this?" Sandra Wilkins, the HOA president, shrieked, her face pale with terror as the officers approached her. "Sandra Wilkins, you are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of power," one of the officers announced, slapping a pair of handcuffs on her wrists. "You have the right to remain silent." The room erupted into chaos as the other board members were apprehended, their protests and denials drowned out by the cheers and applause of the crowd. Julia stood watching, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. Justice had been served, and the corrupt HOA regime had finally been brought to its knees. It was a bittersweet victory, but one that filled Julia with a deep sense of satisfaction. As the officers led the disgraced board members away, Julia knew that the battle was far from over. But for now, she could take a moment to savor the sweet taste of justice, and the knowledge that she had reclaimed her community, one pergola at a time. The sun was just beginning to set as Julia stood on her freshly stained pergola, a sense of pride and accomplishment washing over her. After weeks of relentless battles, the nightmare was finally over. She turned, a warm smile spreading across her face as she watched the neighborhood children scampering around the newly renovated community center, their laughter filling the air. It was a testament to the power of community, to the strength that came from standing united against corruption. "It's over," a familiar voice said, and Julia turned to see Martha approaching, her eyes shining with pride. "Yes," Julia replied, her voice soft. "It's over. The HOA board has been arrested, the misappropriated funds have been recovered, and our neighborhood is finally free from their grip." Martha nodded, reaching out to squeeze Julia's hand. "You did it, Julia. You stood up to them, and you won. The entire community owes you a debt of gratitude." Julia chuckled, shaking her head. "It wasn't just me, Martha. It was all of us, standing together. This was a fight for our home, our community, and we refused to back down." The two women fell silent, watching as the neighborhood came alive with the energy of renewed hope and freedom. Julia could feel the weight of the past weeks lifting from her shoulders, and she knew that the future was brighter than ever. "So, what's next?" Martha asked, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. Julia grinned, her gaze sweeping across the revitalized community. "Well, for starters, I think we should throw the biggest block party this neighborhood has ever seen. And then," she paused, her expression turning thoughtful, "and then we start rebuilding. together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the pergola and the bustling neighborhood, Julia knew that this was just the beginning. The fight had been won, but the journey towards true justice and community had only just begun.